little bit of movie magic. Okay, so we have Sean Byers here from Trademark Belfast. If it would let me put him on the main screen, hold on.
You hear me now?
Yeah. We can. Okay, give us 1 sec. I'm gonna get out. Do you want to just introduce yourself, what you do, and what Trademark Belfast is?
Okay, yeah, I'll try to give you the short version. Sean Byers. I live in West Belfast here. I'm originally from Portaferry, which is a wee rural Catholic enclave outside 30 miles outside of Belfast. I'm a member of Unite for my sins. I'm involved with Belfast Trades Council. I'm also a CATU member in Belfast. I'm not as active as I should be. I've been with Trademark for 10 years now. Trademark has its origins in the trade union movement. It has its origins in a predecessor organisation called Counteract, which was established in the 1990s by the trade union movement to deal with issues of sectarianism, mainly as they affected the workplace. So that was that organisation's bread and butter, and Trademark sort of took on the mantle of doing that same work. But since then, the organisation has evolved to a point where we're doing a lot more political education within communities and trade unions. We're involved in cooperative development, doing a lot of work around racism in the far right now, for obvious reasons. Yeah, so we do a lot of different things, but our roots in the trade union movement is to still play a role in supporting unions and tackling some of these issues.
And how exactly do you support trade unions? Is it mostly through political education or resolving conflicts around sectarianism and racism?
Yeah, well, as I said, for a long time, firefighting was the organisation's bread and butter. So if you include Counteract in that, the peace process was taking hold. There's still legacy issues to address in terms of sectarian harassment and intimidation within workplaces. So Counteract and then Trademark would have been brought in to deal with those from a trade union perspective. And we still do a fair bit of that, not as much. It involves a lot of boring stuff, the strategy for dealing with individual incidents depends on the context, but it tends to involve like a number of different things. So it's mediation in the first place to resolve the incident at an individual level, and that involves a certain level of restorative practices, bringing together the victim and the perpetrator together, to understand the impact of their actions and so on. There's a certain level of community engagement involved in that because incidents tend to spill over into the community, and then there's often sort of sinister elements behind some of these incidents, particularly paramilitary groups operating behind the scenes. And then in parallel with that, there's work around the legislation and the official guidance, which employers and trade unions tend to fall back on. So there's strong statutory protections for minority groups in the public sector. There's strong guidance around how employers across all sectors are supposed to deal with some of these questions to make workplaces safer and more neutral in environments. So part of our job is just ensuring that policies and procedures of employers are up to scratch in terms of what is demanded of them. But then, obviously, this is all the firefighting stuff. Mm-hmm. This is tackling individual incidents.
Yeah.
This doesn't get to the root causes of sectarianism or racism. So that's where the political education comes in. So we do a lot of political education.
Okay.
Among trade unions, community groups, political parties, even social movement organisations, about better understanding sectarianism and racism as a product of colonialism and imperialism. So locating it within that broader, longer history, and then political education around political economy.
And what do you think is your role in Trademark, or what is Trademark's ability to organise against sectarianism in the long term? How do you go about fighting it at the moment?
I can't speak for Trademark, yeah. In terms of political, Trademark as being an organisation that has a membership base or anything like that. I mean, we do, as I say, we provide a supporting role to the likes of trade unions and progressive civic organisations, political parties. The political education is, focused around issues of political economy, so it's equipping members of those organisations and the population more broadly to have difficult conversations with their friends, neighbours, family members, workmates, equipping them to challenge, dispel racist and sectarian myths and disinformation, and providing a convincing systemic explanation for the root causes of the conditions that they're experiencing. So that's where the political education comes in. That's what we do. In terms of I could say something about the trade union movement more broadly, if you like, in terms of its approach, the benefits and limitations of that.
Mm-hmm. I just have a question, if that's okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. I was wondering, you're talking about equipping people to have these difficult conversations. How do you do that? Like,
how do you do that?
Yeah, how do you equip people to have those difficult conversations?
Well, it's equipping people in the first place with understanding, a systemic understanding of the economy, the system under which we live, how it operates, how it functions to produce inequalities, how it functions to produce deprivation, immiseration. So there's that. There's a class consciousness raising an element of it in terms of understanding who the real enemy is, and then just equipping people to understand how the economy works.
Who is the real enemy when you say the real enemy?
Well, they need to state it.
Say it.
The ruling class and how the ruling class uses racism and sectarianism to divide the working class and to undermine efforts at independent working class organisation. It's equipping people to have those types of conversations. At a basic level, there is that myth-busting element that's needed, but it has to go broader and deeper than that. We have to offer more convincing explanations of how and why the economy is organised the way it is, and in whose benefit. So that's what we attempt to do in our own small way.
And do you think that it's like the inequality and poverty in the north, with the north being the poorest region in the UK, that continues to stoke sectarianism, or continues to at least allow it to continue?
Yeah, well, that's obviously a big factor. The areas that were most impacted by the conflict, the areas that are most highly segregated, are also those areas that suffer from the highest levels of unemployment and deprivation along every single indicator you can imagine, right? So, and then on top of that, what you have layered on top of that, as a result of the Good Friday Agreement, for all its achievements, what the Good Friday Agreement did was layer on top of these economic conditions a political system that has institutionalised sectarianism and has encouraged a zero-sum way of thinking about how the economy and how society is organised. So everything is sectarianised. And again, for one part of the community, it's very hard to avoid explanations of that in terms of a loss for another section of the community. And that is how change has been experienced, particularly within unionist working class areas over the past 25 years. Mm-hmm. There's a strong perception that they have lost out politically, culturally, and economically. The statistics don't substantiate that argument, but all that matters is the perception. So we have underlying economic conditions that are generating real material grievances. Mm-hmm. And then layered on top of that is the political system, the so-called settlement that we have, that feeds into that, feeds that idea of resource competition. And if you go back to the outbreak of the Troubles, that's one of the things that created the conditions for the conflict, was this idea of resource competition between two different groups within society. So those things are still very much there, and obviously to remove that perception of resource competition, there's a need for a broader transformation of the economy and politics.
I want to ask you a bit about what's going on in the north right now. So there's been effectively race riots going on the last while all around Britain and the north. Do you think that is stemming from the economic deprivation in the north, or where is this coming from? And also, what is this primarily, are the people participating in this primarily limited to one community, or is this both loyalist and Republican communities that are taking part?
Yeah, this is a difficult one. Need to unpack a lot of history to try to fully understand what's going on here. But for the more recent context, right, in the 6 counties at least, established minority communities have been experiencing harassment, discrimination, low-level violence for decades. And these levels of racism and racist violence have increased since the 2000s, as the north has become just slightly more diverse in ethnic terms. We have very low levels of immigration here compared with the south and compared with Britain, but we have become slightly more diverse. And the complexion of the immigration has changed. So in the earlier stages, there were large numbers who tended to come from Eastern Europe, the new EU accession countries, and they tend to be low-skilled workers and very vulnerable to exploitation and scapegoating. More recently, post-Brexit, there's been a shift towards more high-skilled workers from outside of the EU, and obviously that has a different dimension. But overall, the north has become more diverse. Minorities of all kinds have been increasingly scapegoated for deteriorating socio-economic conditions, for the conditions created by the long period of neoliberal restructuring, and then austerity. So the first spike in racist incidents and attacks came at the height of the austerity period, predating Brexit, okay? So there's a lot of emphasis placed on Brexit as fueling, right-wing nationalist sentiments and so on, and there's an element of truth to that, but this predates Brexit. There's a big spike around 2012 to 2016, and they've spiked again in the last few years. Now you're alluding to it, there is a particular challenge that relates to our own sectarian context. So statistically and anecdotally, the majority of attacks do appear to have taken place in working class unionist areas. Now there's a few things worth noting, to help to explain this. So in the first place, these areas tend to attract a higher proportion of new arrivals due to the availability of cheap rental accommodation. There's a high level of social housing demand in nationalist areas. There's not the same level of availability, so they tend to end up in working class unionist areas. And of course that makes them more visible targets for scapegoating because they're there in larger numbers. These are working class unionist areas. Are also places where there's huge problems of deprivation, disinvestment, deindustrialisation has had a huge legacy, particularly in working class unionist areas. The loss of tens of thousands of secure jobs, and that has a big legacy. Educational underattainment is a huge problem. You have a generation of young lads in particular that have absolutely no fucking prospects or hope. And there's a lot of anger in those communities about the state of things. So as I said, there's a strong perception within loyalist communities that they've lost out as a result of the Good Friday Agreement in every way imaginable. And then these on top of this, these are also areas where local factions of loyalist paramilitaries, I'm not talking about loyalism as a whole, it's a very decentralised, fragmented phenomenon, loyalism. And these local factions of loyalist paramilitaries in certain areas continue to have a tight grip, and then they're only too willing to engage in, to encourage or to orchestrate attacks on minorities. And some do it out of ideological reasons, naked racism. Others do it as a way of just trying to find relevance within their communities, trying to show that they're still in control. You know, the idea of, well, the government won't get to grips with this, we'll fucking deal with it, that type of thing. And unfortunately, they have an army of young lads who are very impressionable, who have nothing to lose, and you know, I'm very susceptible to being influenced to go out and engage in those types of attacks. And then like the weak community structures, compared with some other areas, there's a lack of political leadership. Political representatives within big house unionism are too often found to be justifying or equivocating racism, and you've seen some of the recent statements from the likes of the DUP. Obviously, we don't condone violence, but you know, there's always a but. And you could argue it suits them to deflect the blame on the migrants for the problems in those communities, because those communities have been utterly failed by the people they have elected over a period of 100 years, you know. So I'm not going to say racism is more prevalent amongst the unionist working class.
Yeah.
There are people who are totally horrified by what's going on. There are stories emerging off smaller community organisations and residents mobilising in support of those who have been affected by the attacks. But there are particular conditions that have contributed to the patterns of violence and that have worked against a more organised anti-racist response in those areas. It's much easier to organise an anti-racist response in a Republican area because of all the conditions that don't exist within loyalist areas.
Yeah.
You know, and some of the more positive conditions that do exist.
And do you have much hope for class-based politics being able to organise against sectarianism and racism in the North at the moment?
It's a difficult one. You know, my fear is that there are certain working class areas and working class unionist areas in particular that will be forgotten about. You know, that become places where all the conditions of deprivation exist. I mean, the Good Friday Agreement, there's an argument that, and it's an argument the trade union movement here would make, is that the Good Friday Agreement created the space for class politics to breathe, and that's obviously that has a parallel in terms of the rationale that an Irish Labour movement would have provided in terms of its effective support for the treaty back in the 1920s. And what I would say is that, you know, the Good Friday Agreement has created a certain level of space. You know, the absence of violence, coupled with the generational changes that have come with the passing of time, have in some ways created more conducive conditions for the trade union movement and for class politics to organise. And we've seen over the past 20 years where there have been mobilisations, class-based mobilisations around austerity. There's been a huge trade union movement, and organisations from all backgrounds have played a role in mobilising around social issues like equal marriage, abortion, and then there's the recent strike wave, you know, which does give a certain level of hope, that I hope for, you know, a organised working class politics, but there's limits to how far this can be achieved within the current dispensation. The approach over the past year, the well-intentioned approach over the past year of the trade union movement and others who have attempted to organise around class politics is to, like, you know, manage difference within society, try to preserve the unity of the working class by focusing on bread and butter issues and avoiding the bigger political questions. So the problem with this is that it can only ever be a partial and temporary solution, in a context where the North's constitutional position is increasingly relevant, in terms of partition being one of the key question that continues to divide the working class here.
Yeah.
It's increasingly relevant in terms of just advancing the material conditions of the working class, because if England votes for austerity, we get austerity, and that's the reality of it. You can vote fucking 80 socialists in the assembly, but that's not going to change that bigger reality.
Yeah.
And it's increasingly relevant because the question of border polls and all is on the agenda. And we're living in a time of flux where political demographics are shifting, where sections of the working class are making fresh demands for the likes of the trade union movement to take a stand on political questions, and where it's becoming increasingly difficult to avoid the conclusion that the North is just not a viable economic or political entity, and the different aspirations and the different political outlooks and aspirations that were present back in the time that you were talking about. They're still with us. And until that question's resolved, it's going to be very difficult to organise, politically along class lines.
Okay. I just have two more questions for you. The first one is, one of the things that we talked about was loyalist infiltration in the trade union movement during the 1910s and 20s. And I was wondering, does any of that still exist, or what do you think of, is there any kind of a relationship there? Is it is there a strong loyalist current within the trade union movement that's strong, that's driving people towards it, or are they drawing people away from it, or are they sabotaging it, or anything like that? Is there any kind of special relationship there that's worth noting?
I wouldn't say there's a special relationship, and I wouldn't say that there's a pull towards the trade union movement. I think that, if anything, it's the opposite. That threat has always been there. From the 1920s through into the Troubles period, there's always been that threat of a loyalist breakaway. They called it an Ulster TUC. They threatened to break away if and when the trade union movement, the official trade union movement, or their particular trade union took a position that they weren't happy with, took a position that was in contradiction to their political views.
Yeah.
So that current has always been there.
Yeah.
I would say it's weaker now than it ever was. In large part because the industries where you would have found those that current in the strongest sort of manifestation and most organised form have massively declined. We're talking about engineering, manufacturing, shipbuilding, to a lesser extent the linen industry. All of those key industries have declined, shed tens of thousands of jobs and continue to shed jobs, But there are pockets of loyalism to be found, strong currents of loyalism to be found in particular workplaces and within particular unions. And they continue to try to hold the trade union movement to ransom. Even just recently there have been utterances that because of the particular union's stand against racism and the far right, that they were going to break away in the absence of an apology by the union leadership.
Right.
I would be of a view of that they no longer have the strength really to hold the movement to ransom in the way that they did before, and if they want to walk, let them go. Because their values obviously aren't those of the wider trade union movement. And I think you will see more instances of that, the loyalism within the trade union movement reacting as the conditions continue work against them,
Yeah.
as things don't go in their favour.
Yeah.
And whether it's on the constitutional question, or single political issues. I think you'll see them lashing out a bit more frequently, but they don't have the power or the numbers to really control the direction of the movement in the way that they did before.
Thanks. The last question is just about CATU, and I was going to ask, like, do you think that housing activism has the same ability to unite people across divides, like sectarian divides, or and like across sectarian divides, or skin color, or anything like that that's going on in the north at the moment that trade unionism once had? And feel free to be as critical as you want, because we need to do a bit of criticism around the time of our AGM.
You're not going to find me making very many criticisms of CATU. I think it's one of the most positive and important things that have emerged in Ireland for as long as I can remember. Like what CATU's done is taken a proven model of organising that dates back to an effective model of organising that dates back to the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s, and updated it for the conditions and challenges of the 21st century. And one of the reasons I think this model is so important is the decline of organised labour in the form of trade unions.
Yeah.
Which is, I think you've already gone through this, it's happened both due to the change in structure of the economy, the more precarious nature of work, atomisation of the working class, and the failure of unions to adapt to these changes. So unions find themselves increasingly irrelevant amongst the large bulk of the precarious workforce.
Yeah.
Among young people. Young people aren't replacing retirees at the rate that the unions would need them to in order to sustain themselves. And then there's working class communities, both here and in Cork and Dublin and Galway, you name it, where there are persistently high levels of unemployment and so-called economic activity, where people just aren't part of the labour market at all. And they're beyond the reach of trade unions. There have been limited attempts by unions to organise on a community basis, but they've fallen by the wayside and haven't been as effective as trade unions would have hoped. And while obviously the fight for decent, well-paid unionised jobs is an aspiration of us all, a lot of the challenges that define this era are to be found outside the workplace.
Yeah.
Housing, healthcare, childcare, welfare provision, climate breakdown, migrant rights, all of these areas where there are acute social needs, where the state isn't delivering, and where trade unions generally are nowhere to be found. So I think the CATU model of community, both community and tenants organising, I think that's important. It's not just a tenants union, although that'd be great in itself. Community and tenants organisation is one of the main solutions to this weakness of independent working class organisation in the communities that are most affected by all those issues I mentioned. And one of the things I've been impressed by in the north is that CATU, generally what happens is when a new organisation is established, they fall into established patterns and structures in terms of the way communities are organised. CATU's avoided the temptation to organise within the confines of traditional community boundaries. Instead of saying, well, I have the Falls Road branch and we'll have a Shankill Road branch, no, it's the West Belfast branch. Or treating the East Belfast branch as synonymous as the Broad branch,
Yeah.
It's not, it's an East Belfast branch organised on a geographical basis. Now there's conversations, let's move towards a more centralised Belfast or Belfast model, but the point is that the organisation has gone beyond those traditional community boundaries, organising across the working class and the community as a whole. Now obviously, still having to navigate those issues of sectarianism and racism, which are never far away, but CATU is doing this by organising people around what are common concerns, you know. So I think that CATU is definitely one of the solutions to many of the problems that we have.
Okay, perfect. Thanks a million, Sean. Thanks for contributing to expanding our political education, and I'll probably be on to you asking for some questions about what you do, because we need to get better at it. So thanks a million.
Thanks so much.
No problem.
Thank you so
Here,
much.
we'd be happy to come back anytime, like, and have a chat with you. There's no
Perfect.
just let it go.